Good afternoon. Brink, thank you for inviting me. I hope your hospitality extends to accommodating me in the witness protection program after I'm done. I should have called this talk How to Lose Friends and Offend People. I study businesses, ventures, entrepreneurs at the coalface. I study flesh and blood things. I do not study statistics, and I understand that this perspective can cause me to sort of not get the full picture. On the other side, the people who do study statistics, their statistics are only as good as the underlying models or the underlying process through which these statistics were developed. So the ancient Greeks used to have this very reductive for-humor imbalance model of disease, and they thought that fever was a single disease. Today, if anybody showed up with aggregate statistics on the imbalances between the four humors or tried to track the incidence of people running a temperature, we would laugh at them. So there has to be some congruence between what one studies from the anatomy and physiology of businesses and entrepreneurship and what one represents as being relevant overall statistics. So to answer the general question, is economic dynamism in decline? From my coalface view, largely no. The alarming assessments rely primarily on low productivity growth. Robert Gordon this morning at precisely 11 a.m. said total factor productivity growth is what measures innovation. It is the be-all and the end-all. And I would argue that productivity estimates are incorrigibly implausible proxies for the process that one might reasonably think of as innovation. They are, in fact, bunk. I am much more persuaded by the kinds of data that John presented to us. I think the data that suggests that there are fewer improvised high-growth startups, that's the kind of stuff that warrants real concern. So my remarks today is I'm going to start off by sketching some salient features of what I see to be the characteristic of 20th and 21st century innovation. I will argue that modern innovation, or recent innovation, is much more widely inclusive than it used to be. And it matches creative destruction with non-destructive creation as well. And there's an important complementarity between these two things. If I have the time, I may talk a little bit about the enablers of what makes innovation inclusive in recent times. I will use that as a stepping stone to argue that TFP is an incorrigibly, I don't know why I wrote this, I can hardly speak it, incorrigibly implausible proxy, that it's a superficially seductive construct, and that it inevitably excludes features that makes the economy dynamic. And then I will talk about why declining new business formation and growth warrants real concern. Let's start with what I mean by widely inclusive. Innovation in the 19th century was much more exclusive. It relied on solo inventors or a few entrepreneurs, Thomas Edison, the Duryea brothers. They produced crude, expensive products, sort of and they were bought by a few well-to-do patrons. I mean, Nate Rosenberg has this lovely description of the first cars being noisy, unreliable, and being bought by rich hobbyists who drove around scaring horses. In the 20th century, innovation became much more inclusive. Today's innovation draws on the talents of a very large number of individuals. There is no Graham Bell for the internet. The internet has been created by an army of people with a large number of talents. The same is true of the personal computer revolution. These people produce useful, affordable products from the get-go, and this development of new products and services is matched by what I have called widespread venturesome consumption. And let me spend a few minutes talking about what I mean by widespread venturesome consumption. There is the assumption in economics that consumers are simply passive, undeserving beneficiaries. And this is a quote from Paul Romer. He says, innovators have brought the cost of a transistor down to less than a millionth of its former level, yet most of the benefits from these discoveries have been reaped not by the innovating firms, but by the users of transistors. In 1985, I paid $1,000 per million for memory in my computer. In 2005, I paid less than $10 per million and yet I did nothing to deserve or pay for this windfall. Everything is right except that last crucial clause. And why do I say that? First of all, consumers play an important role in the co-development of products through experimentation and dialogue. But you may say, oh, that's just sort of the leading edge users. But all of us do as well. We are taking risks each time we buy a new product. I have probably since 1982 spent about $200,000 on computer hardware and software. I had no idea before I bought this stuff whether I was going to get value commensurate with the prices I was going to pay for it. If you add up all the purchases of all the people in this room and all the purchases of consumers, I bet we have collectively invested more in computer hardware and software than the likes of Intel, Microsoft, and Google. We're also engaged in resourceful problem solving. I may be kind of dumb, but my computers do not work out of the box for me. I have to spend an awful lot of time tweaking them and tailoring them to make this work. And again, if you add up all the man hours or woman hours that people have spent in getting their computers to work, this probably also swamps the time and energy of engineers at Intel, Google, and Microsoft. So no, we have not been undeserving beneficiaries of a windfall. We, the consumers, have been active, important contributors to this process. And it is the venturesomeness of consumers that stimulates innovations and is essential to realizing their economic value. If there weren't venturesome consumers, all this stuff would be useless and would not be produced in the first place. The second important feature of modern innovation, which people do not think much about, is the idea of non-destructive creation. I mean, Schumpeter gave us this stirring phrase of creative destruction. But if all we had was creative destruction, then we would not have an ongoing process of innovation. Non-destructive creation is an essential feature of technological process, although it's sort of, in our imaginations, it's overshadowed by creative destructions. Yes, some products displace old products. So, famously, the sailing boat was displaced by the steamship, cars displaced horses, but the airplane did not displace cars. A great number of modern medicines do not displace existing therapies. They do things that were not previously done. And this efficiency improvements alone, creative destruction, could not alone sustain growth, because at some point you drive down the prices and costs of stuff to the level where everybody could buy all the existing goods and services. Would be completely sated, and then after that, any further improvements would have to come at the cost of massive unemployment. It is this new want innovation that absorbs the resources released by creative destruction and increases efficiency growth. So let me say a few words about some of the enablers of this modern process of innovation. We've had much greater diversity of organizations. In the 19th century. Innovations were undertaken by individuals or small firms. In the 20th century, we've seen in the first 20 or 30 years a huge increase in the large professionally managed organization. This process of specialization has continued. In the 1980s, we've seen the growth of venture capital-backed firms. And again, this has not been a destructive process. We've seen an increase in the diversity, the organizational diversity of the ecosystem. We've had considerable changes in beliefs and attitudes. We've had self-fulfilling expectations of technological change, such as Moore's Law. So Moore's Law works because people believe it works. We've had people who derive gratification from thrift. This is we've had the devaluation. We've had gratification from early adoption. We've had the devaluation of thrift, and we've had eroding expectations and aspirations for long-term employment. It's not clear that people always had long-term employment, but people at least aspire to it. And again, I may be talking my own book, since I'm basically a business school professor, but we've had a whole range of management techniques which have developed in the 20th century that sustain the process of innovation. We've had the expansion of higher education, again in the 20th century. And let me emphasize that most of these enablers have accelerated in the last 20 or 30 years. It's in the last 20 or 30 years that people have given up on hopes for lifetime employment. It is in the last 20 or 30 years that we've developed techniques such as quality circles, Six Sigma, etc., all of which try to bring in the masses to participate in in the innovation process. It's in the last 10 years that we've had a growth in design thinking. So then, and I could spend the rest of the afternoon reciting all the wonderful things that have been produced by this process of inclusive innovation. But you may say, wait a minute, that's all sort of anecdote, it's journalism. We have this really sort of good stuff called total factor productivity. And let me tell you why I think this is a superficially seductive construct, but practically useless. Superficially, it makes a great deal of sense. You have labor, you have capital, and it's transformed into outputs. And if you measure the efficiency with which this transformation takes place, isn't that a wonderful summary statistic of innovation and dynamism in the economy? Yes, conceptually. But practically, what's the problem? It's incorrigibly uninformative for the following reasons. First off, measures of output and input ignore the surplus in investment of venturesome consumers. Most assessments say that 90% of the value of innovations goes to consumers. 0% of that value is captured in productivity measures. I would make the argument that at least as much, if not many, many more times, the investment that the developers of innovation make is made by the consumers of innovation. 0% of that is captured on the investment side. We have, as I mentioned, a great deal of non-creative destruction. The basket of goods that we consume changes from day to day, from year to year. These baskets of goods are fundamentally incommensurate over time. So it is unreal to talk about real GDP when there is no concept. I mean, you can fiddle around at the edges and talk about hedonic price adjustments, but hedonic price adjustments are picking up dust mites. The real critters are in front of you. These are called new products serving new wants, which did not previously exist. And finally, and possibly most importantly, these models control for changes in inputs. These models basically ignore the heterogeneity of multiplayer innovation. Let me give you examples of two monumental disjunctions. One is the productivity of IT use. I didn't know what Dale Jorgensen was going to say this morning, but I had this quote written down in my. In 2000, he wrote, the evidence was clear that computer-using industries like finance, insurance, real estate, and services had continued to lag in productivity growth. Reconciliation of massive high-tech investment and relatively low productivity growth in service industries remains an important task for proponents of the new economy position. Okay? What are the assumptions that go underneath this? First, no counting of the user surplus or of the users of IT using industries. What about all the surplus of people using ATMs, not included in the counting of the productivity due to IT use? Look even deeper. There's an identical product function for converting inputs into outputs. What kind of assumption is that? I mean, I wander around looking at a large number of companies, and they all have idiosyncratic production functions. And they are idiosyncratic because we live in a dynamic, decentralized economy. It is absurd to assume that these production functions are identical. It is assumed that we are living in perfectly competitive and product factor markets. Sorry, the corner florist may be in a perfectly competitive market, not Walmart. Since at least the 1960s, 50% of the economy has had an oligopolistic structure. How can you assume that we live in perfectly competitive markets? Furthermore, if you assume that, where does the capital come to invest in these IT investments? If we lived in a perfectly competitive market, nobody would have the capital to make these huge investments that were made and continue to be made by the industry. So in some sense, this assumption precludes the very phenomenon that the procedure purports to assess. And here's the reality check. We've had a vast transformation of IT-using industries in the 1900s and the 2000s. Walmart, the banking industry, transportation, industry after industry. Surely the old industry structure did not die spontaneously of Dutch elm disease. Surely in a competitive industry, the replacement of the old structure by the new structure was accompanied by something that one ought to reasonably call an improvement in productivity, one ought to reasonably call innovation. And surely the business people, the people who spent $500 billion, surely they were not stupid. Surely they were doing it because they thought there was value, or at least if they did not make the investments, the value would not be realized. Disjunction 2. I think this is probably the most scandalous disjunction. The alleged soaring total factor productivity in the Great Depression. Yes, as measured, it soared. But is that an indicator of anything desirable or new? So yes, we have these wonderful, creative, long delay explanations. If somebody is wasting away and his clothes or her clothes start falling off, and the scale suggests that that person's weight is increasing, we would suspect the scale, not try to imagine that the person is becoming denser and therefore heavier. So is there a much more commonsensical explanation for the soaring productivity? Yes. Reason 1, massive undercounting of the advances of the roaring 20s. The consumer surplus generated by the creation of mass markets in industry after industry, radios, vacuum cleaners, and most of all automobiles, simply gets no credit in total factor productivity measurements. And this is something which shocked me when I learned about it. The drastic cost reductions due to mass production, which took place after Henry Ford, did not show up in the reduction on the production side because the stuff simply was not included in the price index. So automobiles did not enter the price index until the 1930s. And so this fantastic revolution, this fantastic increase in efficiency of automobiles, not counted in the 1920s. So it gets thrown into the 1930s, and God knows what the reaction is then. So let me say this. It is not that there is a better way of aggregating productivity improvements. It is not that people have been deliberately. I'm claiming that there is a fundamental disconnect between measures of TFP, which assume a monolithic mechanistic process that's fundamentally incompatible with the widespread exercise of individual, let me emphasize the word individual, imagination and agency. And there is simply no way around it. If these things happen to line up with what happens in the real world, that is pure accident. Let me then come to the last point, since I have 5 minutes, and deal with something which I actually agree with. So, why one really ought to be concerned about new business formation and growth. There's in my previous work, I've kind of roughly divided from my case-by-case observation new businesses into 3 categories: the great mass of the great unwashed, the florists, the service industry, the corner retail store, basically is of no consequence to growth and innovation. At the top, we have a few hundred firms which are backed by venture capital, but these are the creme de la creme. In the middle are these 10 or 15% businesses which I've called promising businesses. And yes, we see a huge boom in venture capital, but I'm persuaded by the sorts of data that you've presented that we may be in trouble in that second tier. And why does this matter? It matters to some degree because these under the radar promising firms are undertaking really cutting edge innovations. But I think it matters much more. Again, I say this from my case-to-case observations, because these small firms are vital in the process of disseminating new technologies. On the Inc. 500 list, for instance, year after year, 35% of the businesses are in the computer industry. Very few of them, from my study, are actually developing new computers. What they are doing, though, and what is vital to do, is that they are disseminating these technologies, and without this dissemination, no value could be realized. So they're undertaking what I would call small night and high uncertainty initiatives. Secondly, again, this comes about from my case-by-case research. These are the people who hire the difficult to hire. Large companies generally will not hire people without at least a high school education or without a college degree. They certainly will not hire convicted felons. Venture capital firms will not do that either. The small self-financed startup is not in the process of hiring anybody. So this is a vital part of the inclusive process. And we have, for whatever reasons, we have lost it. I can speculate why this may have happened. I don't think, but I don't think, in fact, anybody really knows. Here is my speculation, since I have 2 minutes. It may be because of regulation. It may be because of these licensing agreements. I'm not so sure. I'm not about to dismiss this, but I can simply say I'm not so sure, because regulation can as much favor large businesses as it can suppress small businesses, because large businesses have the advantage of. But on the other side, a lot of these small businesses are not law-abiding. Sad truth of, I mean, I study them. I mean, they cheat on their taxes, they hire undocumented aliens, they do all kinds of stuff. So in fact, they may actually be helped by increasing regulation. Again, one sees what one sees. Since in the other half of my life I dump on the finance industry, I'd argue that the change in the structure of modern finance, which has gone from a case-by-case, judgment-based process of lending to a process of mechanistic lending, has unduly favored very large companies on the one side or consumer borrowing on the other, that we have destroyed our capacity to extend credit to the small business. The small business cannot tap capital markets. The small business can get started with no external capital, but it cannot grow without bank borrowing. And I think this may be at least one of the crucially important the reasons why the second tier has been losing ground. But I think this absolutely desperately needs looking into. Thank you.